Why don't we start with just a quick summary, Drew, of what the research says, and then we'll get into the significance of it.
Yeah, so the original study for this, they called it the prevalence-induced concept change, like you already said. We're calling it the blue dot effect because that's a lot more sexy and easy to understand. And it's because the first study they did in this was using blue dots. They showed people screens with a bunch of blue dots on it, and they told them pick out the blue dots from all the other dots on the screen. Most of them were like shades of purple and stuff like that. And at first, they say pick out the blue dots, and they pick out the blue dots really well at first. And then slowly over time, they start reducing the number of blue dots on the screen, and people start mistaking more and more purple dots for blue dots. Their concept of a blue dot expands as blue dots become less and less frequent on the screen.
Yeah, so this is the important principle, is that when you remove the blue dots, people don't recognize that the blue dots are no longer there. They redefine what is blue for themselves.
Exactly. Their definition of a blue dot expands to include more shades of purple as the prevalence of those blue dots becomes less and less. Okay, big deal, right? That's just with some dots.
Whatever, yeah.
The really interesting part about this study, though, was that they started to generalize it to other areas too. So like the next study they did with this was with threatening faces. So they show people a whole bunch of faces on the screen, and a lot of them are threatening faces. And they say, okay, pick out the threatening faces. People are really good at this at first. But again, what they do is they start reducing the frequency of threatening faces on the screen. And people start mistaking the not so threatening faces for threatening faces.
Interesting.
As it goes on, right? This generalizes to other things too. They found, they did a series of like 6 or 7 studies with this. One of them they did was what they call moral violations. And they presented people with stories. So no longer visual information, just stories of, okay, we're going to do this study. Is this study ethical or not? Right? And at first they just have some egregiously unethical studies that they're showing people. And they're really, a high frequency of those studies is what they offer them. And then they start giving them examples of kind of like borderline cases and then cases that are pretty benign. Same thing happens as you give them more and more kind of benign or not so unethical studies. People start thinking that, oh, these studies are unethical too. So this is very generalizable across domains. They find this in all sorts of areas. It's a very robust effect that they find, and just absolutely fascinating.
So to translate that for listeners a little bit, basically when you tell people to find threatening things or unethical things, and there are a lot of threatening things or unethical things, people will very accurately identify what's threatening or unethical. But as you remove the threats and the unethical things, people don't recognize that there are fewer threats or unethical things. They redefine what is threatening and what is unethical to continue to see them. This reminds me, like there's a quote in Subtle Art where I actually quote the artist Jose Marti, who said this. He said that when confronted with a life of no problems, the mind will quickly set about inventing some.
Yeah.
And to me, this is like a perfect reflection of that. That like the easier our life gets, the more we define smaller and smaller inconveniences and infractions as being unbearable, as being impossible to withstand.
It happens everywhere.
Like I remember I spent half of 2021 in New Zealand. And one of my favorite things was to go to New Zealand websites and read the headlines. Like read like what they thought of as a catastrophe. You know, it was just, I found it absolutely hysterical. I remember there was one day where there was like a news broadcast came on. People are protesting outside of the prime minister's home. You know, they're upset. And I'm like, oh man, like what's going on? What did she do? And it turned out that there wasn't enough funding for bus lanes or something. And people were just up in arms about that and they wanted her to resign. Like to the point where like they were going and picketing outside of her house. And I was like, man, if that's what gets you to go picket, like I want to know what, like where are the real problems, you know?
But it's a fascinating part of human psychology though, Mark, if you think about it, like what makes us just look for problems constantly? I mean, there's obviously an evolutionary benefit to it, right? Like stay vigilant, everything like that. But that is to the extreme. Like everything could be perfect and we'll make up things.
Problems give us a sense of meaning. We need something to resist against, to feel that sense of progress, to feel as though our life is generating value. The intensity of like what the problem is, you know, things get normalized in both directions very quickly. Like if you live in a war zone, your perception of problems is going to adjust itself accordingly, right? Like a school getting blown up or, a shooting for somebody who lives in South Sudan or Somalia or something, like it's not even going to register. It's just going to be a Tuesday.
So in this study, they also found that when you add the blue dots back in, you start increasing the frequency of the blue dots.
Yeah.
People don't.
They don't adapt back.
They don't adapt back. Right.
Interesting.
So I'm sure that probably generalizes as well. As things get worse, people are like, meh, whatever.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And that's the other thing. Like they've done so many things. They'll tell people we're going to reduce the number of blue dots.
Yeah.
They'll tell them that in the studies. Doesn't matter. They still mistake the purple dots or going the other way too. They don't. They're just like, we're going to increase the blue dots. People just don't, they can't adapt.
I'm going to feel like a fucking old man now. But like, I sometimes worry. I was talking to somebody about this recently, about how we're quickly approaching a point where everybody who lived through World War II is going to be dead, probably the next decade or two. Because I think within society, it's important to have a certain demographic of people who have that perception, whose baseline level of like what a problem is pretty drastic. Because it keeps everybody else in check. Like if everybody else is just, their lives are like too cushy and comfortable, then they're going to start getting upset over spilled milk all the time. And they're going to generate a lot of political strife over things that are just kind of objectively not there. But if you have that cohort of people who have actually seen some shit and actually lived through some serious problems, they can kind of be the check and balance on the rest of the population that hasn't.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, when I was digging around with this too, I found there was a recent study in 2023 that the older you get, the less affected you are by the blue dot effect.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So the more objective you see things.
Well, I don't know. See, that brings up the question. Are you just more rigid in your thinking as you get older, which is kind of the stereotype, right?
Right.
And are you too loose when you're younger, too loose in your subjective moral judgments, or like, so that brings up the question, like, is there a balance of the rigidity of your thinking? And if it varies by age, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Like, back in my day, this was so much worse or whatever. Right.
I mean, it's also just when you're older, you have a greater reservoir of experience to draw upon. Right. So it's like, you've seen thousands and thousands of threatening and non-threatening faces. So you're less likely to be fooled. Or you're less likely to have your definition of threatening be altered so quickly and easily. Whereas if you're young and you've never really been in threatening situations, your definition of threatening is going to move pretty quickly and easily.
Right. That balance, and you're right. I think there needs to be a cohort in society that is more rigid in their thinking and holding like, okay, this isn't actually as bad as it is.
Yeah.
Young people, let me teach you. We are going to be like a lot of like finger waggy at the young people, but I think there is something to that. And it is, if you look at right now, a lot of, the kind of civil discourse that's going on, it does seem to be, there is a lot of like young versus old, kind of rigid thinking versus this is the new way of thinking. And that's how it happens every generation, but that's playing out at scale right now.